Hello,
Hey,
how are you, Mo?
good and you?
I'm good, thank you. Can I quickly test my video with you, please?
Yeah,
Okay.
but stop it.
No, must you start it from your side or can I start it?
I think you
Okay, I
can.
can. Am I,
See, there
am
we
I
go.
clear? Let's start my video. Am I clear? Is it too blurry? There's a light, eh?
Slightly blurry, but it's okay.
Let me see whether I can close the curtains quickly.
Problema.
Better.
Better. Thank you so much for doing this for us.
Hello? Sorry, I couldn't
No
hear
problem.
you.
Thanks so much for doing this for us. We truly
You're
appreciate it.
welcome. Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking
Yeah,
forward to it, Mo.
yeah, we must definitely touch base sometime. We haven't spoken in such a long while. And when I saw when you
Yes.
accepted, I was so happy.
One of my students are online and I told them about your proposal. Hello, Jess.
Hi.
About
Oh,
joining the
sorry.
division.
Hi, Dené.
It's okay, Jess. About joining your division and joining ours and how they could go about that. But then COVID happened.
Yeah, and then, with COVID happening, it's changed so much. I think I'm sure even CaSP can relate. We've had to realign so many things that we wanted to do. And it's, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. It's quite an adjustment, right?
It is quite an adjustment, and we're seeing the implications of the pandemic now, in the beginning, I think, people were still sort of reliant on savings and, things that they had planned and all of that. But now, July, August, people are, they suffering, in my opinion. I mean, I'm feeling it a lot more.
Yes, but also the adjustment in terms of not being able to do things the way we used to. For
Mm,
instance, with us now having to work from home and
yeah.
having to do things online, it's not easy.
No, it's not easy. And even from a student perspective, so, at the moment, obviously, I'm studying at 𝑨𝒗𝒊𝒄𝒕.
Yes.
Um, and the online classes and adjusting, like, people would think I came from UNISA, so
To
it's
be
fine,
able to just adjust.
but it's not.
Mm, mm.
Yeah.
Even learning from a distance is not always easy. And you are
No,
now at
no.
𝒃.
Mm, no, it's not. It's it's been challenging, eh?
Yes, I'm greeting Genevieve. Hi, Genevieve.
Hello, how are you, Mr. Rand?
You can call me Dené, please.
Dené, okay,
Yes.
I will do that. Hi, Dené. It's so nice to meet you. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate this.
Yes, welcome. Thank you for having us and having me.
When I looked through your bio, I thought this is a busy person.
Yeah, we're quite busy at the moment, but I'm looking forward to doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, Mo. How are you?
Good, good. I'm going to love and leave you guys. I've got a meeting in 10 minutes, unfortunately.
Thank you.
But good luck, and hopefully I'll join towards the end.
Okay, great.
All right. Enjoy.
Thank you. Take care. Why am I saying take care to Mo? Like I'm never going to see him again.
We used to saying things sometimes to people. Yes, Jane.
No, that's true. That's true. So I'm very excited for today. We'll get started at 2 o'clock to give our participants enough time to join us. But community and social psychology is a field that is so important to psychology and often misunderstood. So yeah, I think this will be a very good exposure to students and also to let students know about CaSP and what CaSP does.
Yes.
You are very active. You are an active division.
Yes, we are. We are quite. I joined CaSP, I think, sometime last year. So I've been part of the division for, let's say, a year almost. So the other people have been part of CaSP for a longer time. But just my involvement with them, and I'm really enjoying it, even though it's in a short period of time.
So
I was speaking, no, go on.
No, sorry, carry on.
No, I was speaking to Mo. Before COVID happened, we were talking about getting students from UNISA to join your division and join CaSP, so that it also contributes to their development.
Yes, definitely, and especially with UNISA's degree, with their specific degree in counseling psychology. And, you know, the thing is, Dené, the reason why we started this Ask Us Anything webinar series is because we realized that there was such a gap between students having access to lecturers, but not just to lecturers, to professionals, to specialists in a specific field. And that gap was highlighted with the messages that we received on social media and via email, where students were uninformed about certain aspects of psychology and their various choices, because I think when everyone goes into psychology, it's always with the intention of studying clinical psychology without realizing that there's an array of different options. Yes, absolutely. So
I agree with you, Genevieve. I think when I was a student, I had that same struggle, not having the information readily available. I had to speak to people, and that's how I found out how things work. And I agree with you, if there's platforms where we can make the information accessible, will be so much better, and not leave the students feeling as if there's no other way out. Because a lot of the time you feel trapped when you're done with honors. What do I do next? If I don't do the masters.
Exactly,
but there are other options.
That's such a good point, is that many students get to honors level and they don't know what to do with their degree.
Yes.
Yeah, we see it all the time. We see it more often than not with so many, honestly, about 50% of the queries that I receive on social media and via email are from students saying, I'm about to complete my honors degree, or I've completed my honors degree, what now? What
do I do next?
Exactly, yes.
How do you guys handle those questions, Genevieve, from the division side?
Well, we provide them with information with regards to, okay, you've got an academic honors degree now. Where do you envision yourself when you started your degree, or when you started honors or completed honors? Where would you see yourself if one thinks of one sort of vision board? Provide information about the BPsych degree, because many students don't know that with an academic honors degree, you can't practice with the HPCSA as a registered counselor. So that's something that we actually see the most of, is I'm doing my academic honors, or I've got my academic honors and now I can't practice. So we provide information about the BPsych or BPsych equivalent. Psychometry is another option. And then with regards to masters, the various different scopes of masters. And the HPCSA has a brochure with all of the HPCSA accredited universities in South Africa that offer RC, psychometry, and every different scope of psychology. So to at least provide them with that information. And then we take it from there with regards to their feedback, if we get feedback from them. But we see that very, very often.
But I'm sure
Dr. Cherrington.
Hello, Evie.
Hi, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well.
Hi, Dr. Cherrington. Yes, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it today. I'm very excited for the webinar. Dené, do you get a lot of questions? Because you're a lecturer at UNISA, so do you get a lot of queries with regards to what now? Where do we go?
Not since I've been a lecturer, Genevieve, to be honest. I've been with UNISA for almost a year also, so also not that long. But prior to that, people used to ask if I'm in psychology, or I'm studying psychology when I was still a student at the time. they would pose those questions, and all I could do was give them my experience, because I've navigated the route that you suggested now. I went the B-Psych route and then got into the clinical shortly after that. But I also I did the B-Psych as a plan B because of not always getting into masters and the uncertainty with that, yeah.
That's a very good point, to at least have a plan B in psychology, and at least with your RC and with your B-Psych, you can register with the HPCSA should you not manage to get
into the masters, yes.
Yeah.
Or the psychometry route, like you said.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, very interesting that there's so many different aspects to psychology that certainly when I started studying, I wasn't aware. I mean, I'd been onto the HPCSA's website, I'd done my homework to see what one would need to study psychology. There's so many different parts of psychology and elements of psychology that it's very exciting, and the more information we get, definitely the more it empowers us.
True. Also just the approach to it, or thinking differently about it. If you're usually we go into it because we want to become psychologists, but that knowledge is not in vain. You can always utilize the knowledge and apply it in a different context, not necessarily as a psychologist. But usually we go into it because we want to become psychologists. I think maybe to be creative in how we think about these things.
There you go, creativity. Yes, definitely. So to our participants, we will start at 2, just to give the rest of our participants an opportunity to join us. Hello, Noor, I saw you, but now I don't see you. But now I see you.
How are you?
Well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing good, thanks. So nice to see everyone.
Hello, Noor.
Hi.
Thank you so much for helping us organize this, Noor. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it wasn't a problem at all.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, and we are recording this. Okay, and Noor, once I've got the video from PsySSA, once Mo sends me the video for this recording, I'll post it on our social media channels, but I'll also post it on our YouTube, but I'll send you the link so that you can share on CaSP's social. Great.
That'll be perfect. Thanks, Genevieve.
Thank you. I'm trying to look like I'm not freezing cold. So if I'm moving around, that's why. I'm telling myself I'm not cold.
Oh, did it?
Okay, so it's 2 o'clock. Let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the PsySSA Student Division's next Ask Us Anything webinar. Our next series focuses on community and social psychology. We're very excited to have executive committee members from PsySSA's Community and Social Psychology Division, or CaSP, Dr. Avivit Cherrington and Ms. Dené Du Rand. Thank you so much for joining us today and taking the time to answer these questions. We really do appreciate this. Dr. Cherrington is a registered educational psychologist with expertise in community development and system-level program design for transformative change. Dr. Cherrington is also the chairperson of CaSP, and Dr. Cherrington's research focuses on transformative change in South Africa teacher education programs aimed at developing future teachers as agents of hope and social change. Dr. Cherrington has also facilitated workshops at national and international conferences on using visual participatory methodologies in community-based research as change. Dr. Cherrington, that's impressive. Ms. Dené Du Rand is a clinical psychologist and full-time lecturer at the Department of Psychology at the University of South Africa. She's also part of the clinical team that is responsible for the Masters in the Clinical Psychology program, And in the clinical program, Dené teaches community, critical and gender psychologies, African epistemologies, and ecosystemic theory. Ms. Du Rand is also an executive committee member of CaSP, and her research interests include Indigenous collective trauma, historical trauma, Indigenous knowledge and healing systems, decolonial theories, and community health and well-being. So to all of our participants, you are in very good company. We encourage your participation today. The structure of the webinar is as follows. Dr. Cherrington and Ms. Du Rand will answer questions that we have received via email and social media that were already submitted to them. Afterwards, we'll take questions from our participants. So if you can either raise your hand, you can send a message in the chat function, and if you'd like to remain anonymous, you can send me a message privately. You can also mute yourselves. I see everyone is muted. We are recording this, so for quality purposes, we're going to keep participants muted until you have a question or a comment. This webinar will also be posted on the Student Division social media platforms and YouTube channel and will be shared by CaSP. Also, please visit CaSP's website. We're all here because we're interested in community and social psychology. So I will share CaSP's website link as well as CaSP's social media handles in the chat bar. And if you have any questions afterwards, you are welcome to email me. I am Genevieve. I'm the Vice Chairperson of the Student Division. And we're also joined by Nur Ahmed, who is a psychology master's student at WITS, doing master's coursework and research reports. And Nur is a student representative for CaSP. So let me post those links now. And then Dr. Cherrington and Ms. Du Rand, if you'd like to go ahead and address the questions that were sent via email.
Cool. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation. So in true community psychology style, Genevieve, we are going to color outside the lines and completely do it differently. Yeah. And we thought we would really like, we read the questions, thank you everybody for those, but we thought we really want to get an idea of what you as psychology students understand by the concept of community psychology. You know, what does that mean to you, or what do you know about being a community psychologist? So yeah, anything, start the chat or raise hands or anything, but really to kind of get some idea and conversation going before we start in hearing what your perspectives are.
Okay, great. So if anyone would like to unmute yourself and go ahead and answer the question, I really do encourage your participation in this webinar. This is a brilliant opportunity to draw on Dr. Cherrington and Ms. Du Rand's expertise. So if you'd like to unmute yourself, or if you're feeling a little bit shy and would like to send me a private message, you're welcome to do that.
And we're not looking for big academic things, just generally you've had some exposure to psychology here because you're interested. So what is it that you know about community psychology? What does it interest you about? How do you even see that?
You're also welcome to share your experiences with it, be it in undergrad or honors, working as a volunteer, NGOs.
I suppose I'll say something.
Hello.
Hello. I am a honors student at the moment, and when I hear community psychology, my first thoughts are to do with just the pure lack of, most communities having access to mental health, and the massive treatment gap. You'll especially see that with your NGOs where, like volunteering at different places. Like a lot of the time, we don't know where to refer people to. We don't know you know, you could do basic containment, but where do you put them to? Where do you transfer them to? And then also, if you transfer them to a specific NGO, are they going to be, what's the word? Are they going to be sensitive to different cultural ideas? And which I don't think is always the case if you send them to, you know, like the only counseling center in Limpopo that just happens to also be Christian or something like that. So when I hear that, that's what I associate.
Wow, thanks very much.
Thank you, Leanne.
Thank you.
Other thoughts?
Okay, maybe I should unmute myself. We've received a few messages via chat. Community level analysis focused on power relationships, factors that disempower oppression, social injustice, and those that empower. And Annalise said, I would say it is a psychologist working with community environment, focusing on bettering mental health within those communities, including education and awareness. And then also another question with regards, following Annalise's statement, is would community psychologists work closely, for example, with social workers? What kind of quote unquote team would community psychologists work with?
Okay. Anyone else? Yeah, so I'm picking up a lot of very, very crucial key things here in terms of the community level, you know, working with the community, within the community, mentioning being culturally sensitive. So it's not just about referring people who are maybe of a different culture, ethnicity, language, but then how would we kind of engage as psychologists with that? And in what capacity would we work as community psychologists, right? And so for me, you know, this is very, very important, but I think for me, what I learned, because I also came the route of educational psychology, that's what I studied. And in my internship year, I was offered an opportunity to work with the Catholic Church in their HIV and AIDS office, and that threw me into community psychology head first, and I'd known very little about it. And I basically learned on the ground. And that was what I went into community psychology thinking and understanding in the exact way as you've just represented it, that I'm the psychologist and I'm working with or within a community, and my role is to then make sure that the people I work with, who are generally always marginalized, that's what I thought, and it would be my role to make sure that they gain access to the best possible psychological mental health care. That was my understanding, right? So I think for me, the best way to explain what community psychology is, and bear with me here, is a parable or a story. And I don't know if you've heard this, but it's a story about the village and the river. And as the story goes, that there was this beautiful village, and it was a small village, but everybody knew everybody. They had a very basic life, but they were happy. They had survived wars and hardships, but they'd endured, and they'd also flourished, and they were living a good life. They had systems in place, they had a good leader. And one day this little boy was sitting by the river, and he saw a body floating down the river, and he panicked, and he called his father, and his father came, and they saw this body floating in the river, and they pulled it out, and the whole village had a conundrum. What is going on? What is this? Who is this? Where did they come from? We don't know. And they thought, well, you know, it must have just been an accident or an incident or something up the river. But you know what? A couple of days later, another body floated down. And again, the children ran to call the parents, and they came, and another body came. And before the end of the week, this was becoming a regular thing. And another week, and there was another body. And another week, and now there was 2 bodies. And before you know it, it became a daily thing. And now every day there was a body floating down the river. And the village people were going, what is happening here? But you know, we can't just let these people float and the bodies. So we've got to have a system to pull these bodies out the river and give them a proper burial, because we believe, you know, in I don't know who these people are, but they need to have a proper burial. And so they downed their tools and their farming, And they started to find a system of bringing these dead bodies out of the river. And before you know it, they couldn't be farming, and so they weren't having food for themselves, and the children couldn't go to school because the entire village was so focused at pulling these bodies out the river and burying them. And now they ran out of land because they were burying all these bodies. And until eventually somebody came to visit the village and they saw this mayhem going on, and they said, wow, this poor village, you know, look at them, what are they doing? They don't have schooling, they don't have farming, they're not using the land. All they're doing is they're pulling these dead bodies out the river. We better help them. And so they brought a lot of money, and they brought the NGOs and the churches and international funders, because these poor people. And so they spent a lot of money to help them to mechanize the systems to pull the bodies out the river, and they helped them to build a crematorium, and they helped them to do all these things so that these poor people wouldn't have to do all this horrible work of pulling bodies out the river. But nobody ever thought to say, but this isn't their problem. Why don't we go up the river and find out what is going on? Because if we stop the bodies from floating down the river, this community could get back to being who they are, right? And that is, for me, the essence of community psychology, is that so often psychology is so focused on helping the present mental health of individuals and of communities, of saying, gosh, we have so many people have depression and so many people have this, and, you know, we must help this community. And I say this community because we're always referring to a community that is less fortunate, that has less access, that is marginalized. When does the issue really belong to that community, or is that community simply bearing the burden of the issue somewhere else? And so as a community psychologist, we focus on empowerment, we focus on prevention, we focus on promotion and advocacy of understanding if there's an entire community or society or nation or grouping of people that is experiencing or afflicted by the same thing, it ceases to be an individual's problem, right? And working with it at an individual level is like helping people to build a crematorium. It's not really going to help or change in any way, right? And it becomes systemic, it becomes generational, and so forth. And that's why community psychology is not necessarily a specific registration of psychology. It's an orientation to the way we practice what we are trained to do. And so whether it's in a counseling or clinical or educational, it's really about understanding the basics of psychology. It's still about human behavior. It's still about mental health. But instead of looking at the problem that lies within the individuals or within the family, we are looking at the bigger systemic level and saying, what is causing this, and where's that intervention going to be most helpful in promoting well-being and change? So that's really my input on that before we get to the questions. So I don't know, Dené, if I can pass it on to you to give you a little bit of time to explain, and then maybe we can open for more questions.
Sure, Evie. I was smiling as you were giving the description of your view of community. And I think everyone that mentioned something had touched on an aspect of community psychology. And it's like you're saying, Evie, it's utilizing the resources within the community. In my mind, yes, there is no category to register as a community psychologist, but community psychology as a discipline gives us skills to formalize, I'm referring specifically to South African context, psychosocial problems within their context and not locating it within the individual and therefore running the risk of blaming or making someone a victim. I think someone was talking about different analysis, but it's also that different level of understanding how a problem is formed, but that we also address it on different levels. And it speaks to the aspect of, does a psychologist, for instance, work with a social worker? Of course, you have different networks that addresses the different needs of be it the individual or be it the community. Yes, the psychologist has psychological understanding, but the social worker addresses social issues. Not all of us can do everything all at once. So yes, I liked the way you explained it, Evie. I think you covered it well.
And I think the key here is to also see community psychology as not being static, which is what makes it so different from the hierarchies of psychology. You know, generally, like in educational psychology, you could work in schools, or you could have private practice. You know, it's very siloed, and you know, it's the same with counseling. I just assume with clinical. Whereas as a community psychology, it depends where you fit in and what you're looking at. So, for example, I was a community psychologist where I worked for the HIV and AIDS office of the Catholic Church and all of those international funders. And I would be one of those people going to the village and saying, gosh, you know, everyone's stressed and the children are having anxiety and there's all this violence because the children are seeing dead bodies. Gosh, what can we do? You see? But then you have to look at the systems level of it. And one aspect of it might be in terms of the development. And so it would be, right, well, I'm not going to be here for very much longer. So I don't want to create dependency. And I certainly don't have 12 sessions and a medical aid to cover my time. So I need to make this as effective and meaningful as possible. And so the best thing to do is look for assets and resources. And so I wouldn't even work with the children or the community members. I would identify the leaders. I would identify, you know, who would be the person who would help here, or who would be the chief, or who would be, and I would pull together a resource team, and that might include teachers, it might include social workers. You know, it depends. Every community is different, but it would be leaders in that community, because they are the ones who are going to need to impact the change, not me, right? So I'm there to really kind of have a systems level overview and thinking, to understand certain things, but knowing very well that I don't have the knowledge. I'm just simply putting pieces together and getting the resources. The knowledge is not with me. The knowledge is always in that community, and they know best what they need to get to where they need, but I know how to access what they need, so I can get that to them, so I can connect them with resources and networks that will make things different or better for them, right? And then there's obviously an aspect of advocacy, because, you know, that village after years and years and years has probably forgotten its way of life. It's so focused on survival and stress, and it's been so influenced, and maybe the chiefs are not taking money from USAID because they're getting a crematorium, you know. So all of those factors are things that I have to, with my training, put my glasses on and see beyond the ground level, to see how further up it goes, and to see what is influencing the situation, you know. And so that's where we start looking at bigger things in terms of patriarchy, in terms of social conditions, in terms of poverty, you know. Where is it coming from, and what are the barriers within our societies that are causing the anxiety and depression and everything that's coming with it. So as a community psychologist, you could work on the ground with a community, you could work in NGOs or international organizations, you could work in academic sphere. If you're coming in as a research psychologist, then, you know, that's also, you can look at those aspects. So it really is a way of doing what you're already doing, but just looking at issues in society and looking at mental health from a different perspective. Yeah.
I think also, if we're talking about communities and problems within communities, but if I can share an experience that I had when I started, I think it was my ComServe year, and stepping into a hospital, I used my community psychology teaching to establish relationships, to connect with the stakeholders of the hospital before I could even do anything within the hospital, or even start seeing patients within the hospital. So it's not merely just that it's a way of dealing with community problems. It's like Evie was saying, it's that lens that we utilize to navigate spaces in which we are going to bring about healing, or where healing is meant to occur. And that attitude of not thinking you are the expert. Yes, you have knowledge regarding psychological processes, etc., but to tap into the knowledge inherent within that community, so that you empower them, and that you have, once you've stepped out, they can continue going on without you. And also, like I think Evie, you hinted on prevention, that we look at the long-term implication of what is currently going on and how do we put measures in place, be it on an individual level, be it on a societal level, be it in terms of policies, to stop these problems from occurring in the future. I'm wondering, Avi, whether there's other questions that is maybe because of what we've said, that you guys have maybe other questions that you'd like to have answered.
Please do ask away.
So that we engage in a conversation.
I may ask you, Dr. Cherrington, you're an educational psychologist, and Ms. Du Rand, you're a clinical psychologist.
Yes.
Did you always know during your academic career that you wanted to work with communities, that you wanted to work in community psychology, or was it something that you discovered throughout or during your degree? And what was the pull for you? What was the draw to community psychology?
So for me personally, I studied my through University of Pretoria, and community psychology in my honors, I think, was a module or even less. And yeah, in my masters, it was a component of, so when we did career counseling, there was a component of community career counseling. If we, so everything had a component, but there wasn't really, I knew very little about it. I was very active in terms of understanding African-centered psychology. That really interested me, and liberal psychology and critical psychology. So those kind of branches was more of a hook for me. I didn't know that there was this thing called a community psychologist. And so when I went into education, it was more because I wanted to work with children who had learning barriers, and I was inspired by a video by Dr. Malavini, who's an American psychologist, psychiatrist as well. But he kind of worked with children to understand how they think and to demystify this idea that children don't have learning barriers. It's the system that isn't accommodating to the different way we think. And I really like that. So that's why I went into educational. And like I said, it was only when I got offered a full-year fellowship to work with, it was PEPFAR at the time, and they placed me with the Catholic Church. And I was excited because HIV and AIDS was huge. It was the late 90s, early 2000s. And so it was this, I really wanted to be a part of all of that, right? And so that's how I got thrown into it. And it was only working in community that I started realizing, but everything I studied just doesn't work. It's not relevant. I can't do any of these things with the children, and it makes no difference if this little guy is dyslexic, because he's got there's a list of other things, and just being in a community made me realize that there has to be a different way of doing this, because I could work for 12 sessions with this child or this family or this school, and nothing's going to change because I'm kind of hitting the brick, so that's where I got involved in it. And it was only in my PhD that I did after that was my focus. But there was no community psychology. You couldn't study community psychology. You couldn't do a PhD in community psychology. So the best I could do is find a promoter or supervisor that I really respected her. I really respected her way of doing research. She was doing visual participatory, which was the way I was doing psychology. So I started doing a lot of courses on visual methods and Sandtray and play therapy, because language was an issue, because, and so that became my way of being a psychologist in a community setting. And so that's how I followed my PhD. And it was only really from there that I realized the scope of it. But having said that, it's very limiting, because I struggled a lot in my academic career because I couldn't be placed anywhere, because my scope of practice is educational. And so as an academic, I could only apply to lecture in educational psychology because I could only supervise educational psychology. But I knew nothing about psychometric tests. I knew nothing about barriers to learning, because since my practical year, my entire career was doing completely different work. It was in the field of community counseling. And yet community counseling seems to sit more in the counseling psychology and the clinical, right? And so when I went to universities to say, but I could lecture community, I could teach your students, I've had years of experience, I could show them new ways of doing this, but they couldn't hire me because my scope of practice is educational and they would need me to supervise, you see. And so it's this, you kind of get stuck in the middle where you gain this wealth of experience, and universities will tell you, we can't have a community psychology master's because there aren't enough people to supervise it. And it's because there's one scope of practice and then there's another experience of what you're doing. And the more you get into the field, the more you actually tend to move away from that very, very limiting scope of practice. So, you know, so you've also got to think about where you are wanting to evolve into, because if it is an academic career, you know, the boundaries are quite tight. Whereas if you're wanting to go more into public service and other areas, you get a wealth of experience, and nobody really cares what you registered as long as you're registered as a psychologist and you have a health council registration. Nobody goes, you know, except for medical aids, nobody says, oh no, but you're this or you're this, you know. So, and I think that's where the dissonance also lies.
I think for me, it was both a personal experience and also having been exposed to a lot of people who's working in the field, not necessarily registered as community psychologists, but doing a lot of community related work. So I think, and this is now obviously in retrospect speaking about this, when I initially registered to study psychology, I didn't think like this. So I come from a community with a lot of psychosocial problems. And I used to always ask, why does certain people develop these problems and why do others not? And I think that the mainstream training didn't really completely answer my questions. And so I started reading up on things and having conversations with people. And I think community psychology gave me a lens to make sense of these things, but also exposing me to things like liberation psychology and indigenous psychologies and indigenous ways of knowing, that gives me a better understanding of the problems that I saw in my community and that myself also experienced. And then obviously I spoke to people who were actively engaged with community work, and they were able to make me differentiate between, I think Evie hinted or spoke about it a little bit, in terms of you are registered in a certain category and it almost limits you to do certain things, but no one limits you to think broader, to use it as a lens to make sense of things. And I started doing it like that, and hopefully as I continue on my career, I can get more involved into community work and work really on the ground.
Thank you, Dr. Cherrington and Ms. Du Rand. I appreciate that. And really what is coming through is the passion for community psychology, or for psychology in general. And Dr. Cherrington and Ms. Du Rand, you found a way through it, whether it's getting your master's and then your PhD in Ed Psych and then going into community psychology, because as you say, community psychology is not a registration category with the HPCSA, but there are different ways around it. I think that's a very good message to impart to students, is that should a student really want to work as a community psychologist, there are options. There are many options available to get into community psychology. You just, Mr. Rand, as you said earlier, sometimes you have to be creative about how you get there.
I think, Genevieve, to add to what I said earlier, that's the way I sidestep many of these traps, or that I feel like it's traps, or perceived to be a trap, is to think differently about them. Because obviously you have to be ethical in your behavior, but it doesn't mean you cannot think differently about it. And when I started thinking differently about it, I positioned myself in a different way in my engagement with, be it now the psychological problems or be it with the communities that I engage with. There was a difference there in the way I interact and engage with these things.
Thank you very much. We do have questions in the chat. So would you like to address the questions in the email, and then we'll go into questions and from the chat and from the participants?
Okay, so in terms of the questions that we got in the email, it was mostly about how do you study for it, and I see in the chat it's also how do you go about getting into this this field. And it's really what Dené was saying, you know, you have to make that path. And unfortunately, as students still, you don't have a lot of choices, but there's a lot of readings out there, and we'll actually put a page for you with some links and references and chapters, because this isn't new in South Africa. It's actually, and we were talking about in our division, because we have layers of people who started the movement, and then sort of us as academics and the younger people coming in. And this has been 30 to 60 years of fighting institutions and academic scopes of practice, right? And so what you have to do is you've got to find a way to color within the boxes, right? And read, attend webinars. There's so much more knowledge out there. And I promise you, once you get outside of the institutional space, that kind of thinking is so relevant and it's so needed, right? Because we already know, and I'm sure a lot of you are aware when you go, people are tired of psychology. Psychology's got a very mainstream kind of reputation for being very elitist, and you know, and so often being a community psychologist, I found it captures my essence of being an activist very strongly, because I'm always challenging and motivating and arguing for things, you know, and using the knowledge that I have as a psychologist in order to really advance that kind of thinking. And it's not necessarily that I'm trying to I'm making things better for a specific community or society, but instead of doing it working on the ground, I'm doing it by trying to break the power dynamics that have got a hold on that, right? And so it's really about going out there and using that different way of being and different way of thinking that will get you jobs, that will get you into places. And I think you can see now with everything that's happened with COVID, and if any of you attended our very first webinar, you know, when everything started shutting down and we were all terrified, and I think Leanne spoke a little bit about it just now, you know, how do so many people cannot access mental health? Why? Why are they not accessing mental health? That is the questions that is where we should be fighting. That is where we should be making the changes as community psychologists. And I don't want to minimize going out into the field and helping people with food, because basic necessities is always important. But the idea here is that it's not the person that we should be focusing on, but, you know, and those kind of ideas of where we can no longer, psychologists only being trained to do one-on-one and group counseling, because that is the only training we get. And not only is it not effective for bigger issues and problems, but it's also not in line with our way of being in the world. And it's a very westernized, Eurocentric way of thinking about mental health that just does not work actually in most countries in the world, okay? And so we can't continue to do that. And so when you go on and you are thinking in a different way, then organizations want that, because they do instinctively understand that makes better sense than having a psychologist do one-on-one couples and family therapy, right? And so they do get that. And it's also about thinking of yourself as a hierarchy. You know, you're not there, it's not that you're at the top, but there's one of you. And for every one of you, there's probably about 4 or 5 social workers. And for every social workers, there's at least 10 child and youth care workers. And for everyone, you know, and that becomes a system that you work together. And that's where the strength lies. So it's really about seeing those opportunities and starting to get into that and reading up about it and going to organizations. And I think you will find that once you are having that orientation, you will find employment opportunities. And it might not be called community psychologist, but it certainly will entail those kinds of ways of thinking.
I think, Evie, you answered most of the questions that were posed to us via email. There's just one question in terms of, if someone is qualified as a psychometrist, can you then go back and become a clinical psychologist or study, join masters in clinical psychology? Of course you can. Doesn't mean if you're trained in one category, you can't join the other one. And I agree with most of the things that Evie is saying. It is about creating change at deeper levels, not just merely on the individual level. We sometimes forget that we can also do research, and through our research, we can effect change within policies of people informing these policies, because all of us have a role to play. I cannot make policy, it's the role of Parliament to do those things, but it does not mean I cannot play a role in terms of informing them from a psychological point of view, and harnessing the strengths that everyone has within the community, because I think, Eddie, you also linked to it in terms of formulating the problem. It's not one person's problem, and it's not one community's problem. It's all of us, and it's all of our responsibilities to contribute to dealing with these things.
I'm interested in the chat. I can see that Nontokosa, you say you're currently doing a community psychology degree. Where are you doing a community psychology degree?
In UNISA.
Okay, that's not a, remember that there's no registration for community psychology. So you can't actually do community psychology degree. You're doing a master's, or you're doing a degree in psychology. And you will be, once you graduate, either counseling or clinical or research educational. Your specialization is community, but there is no, and I think we must be very clear with that, because we throw around the word very easy that we're studying community psychology, or I am a community psychologist, but there is no registration for that, right? So it means that what you are is you're a counseling psychology, or you're an ed psych, or you're clinical. And those, there are many jobs for, right? So don't think that because you're only a community, you can only work in a specific, in the realm of community. So that's the one thing. So you just need to see what your registration is, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how long you study, if you don't get your health profession council board exam and register. The second thing I want to just highlight is that I think we also have a very limited definition of community. And this comes from our very colonial neoliberal kind of roots of having, European and global North countries coming in as telling us what is right and what is wrong, and they have the money. And so community, we've become to understand a community is always marginalized, they're always poor, they're always, right, have issues. And that's not at all what a community psychologist looks at, because most of the burden sits with a marginalized community, but the problem is not theirs, right? The problem's up the river. And so a community could be anything. If you think private schools don't have issues of gangs, violence, suicide, pregnancies, then you haven't been to a private school, right? Money does not take away mental health issues and acting, right? It's just experienced in a different way. So communities could be anything and anywhere. And if we really look at issues such as societal issues, feminism or sexism that women are experiencing is not a woman's problem. It sits with the men who are looking at it that way, right? So I could work with women and work on their sense of self-esteem and confidence. That's not where the problem sits. The problem, the shift needs to happen in that community, in their way of thinking about women. And it's the same with racism. It's the racism sits with a Black community, but it's their burden to carry. It's sitting with, the people who are the white folk who are saying that. So it's a shift, because we tend to always think at the problem. And so we think that's a community. Well, that's not where the community, and that's not where the issue sits. You need to change things there in order for this community to thrive, because they were thriving just fine before you started putting labels right onto that. And so that's also a shift that we need to do with our training.
And also I think it's important for me personally, to include more of this in the training, whether it is from undergrad up until masters, especially because it's so relevant to have this way of thinking and doing things within this context. I remember for me as a student initially what the issue was, and I think I said it also in why I am so interested in this approach, is that a lot of the mainstream theories do not address the problems within the South African context. And if you continually address a problem with the wrong intervention, you're exacerbating the problem. So we need to find other creative, more innovative ways of addressing these things. And sometimes it means stepping out of the box of psychology, like community, I think the approach community psychology did, going and taking from other disciplines and utilizing those things, because at the end of the day, it's all about healing and empowering and making the world a bit of a better space for all of us to live in and to thrive in. So yes, I genuinely think community psychology needs to be integrated more within our training, not just on a content level in terms of exposing us to different theories, but to start changing the way we think about these problems. So on a perception and on an intellectual, in our minds, it needs to change.
Yeah, and I think that's been a lot of why we don't have a separate registration for community psychology. And if you read a lot of the books that have been written by South African scholars in the field, it's always comes down to the idea that, but why should we have one scope of, you know, as psychologists, shouldn't we all be thinking on this other level? You know, is this traditional mainstream psychology even relevant anymore for our own society, or shouldn't we all have a different way of orientating ourselves towards human development and mental health? And so by having one scope, it then limits everybody else. And so that is really been the argument. And I see on the chat as well, Nomkhidi, you asking about the master's program, you know, and this is like, it's very difficult because academia is like a monster of its own, you know. And I think when academics starts to cross the boundary with industry, it becomes difficult, because we all know academics get paid very little, right, for the amount of hours and work and strength they put in. The pay is not there. You get other benefits. Now, as a psychologist going through 7 or 8 years of studies to do your internship and a board exam, you're more likely to get a better salary in private practice or in other forms than you are in academia. So there are very few psychologists that get that far. Now remember, to supervise someone else, you must also have 5 years on top of that, right? So now when you've put in your 7 years and you've done the board exam and you've given another 5 years, it becomes a toss-up whether you're not comfortable with the salary you have to be in an academic sphere. And so very few even go on to a master's level, because as a psychologist, whether I have a PhD or master's, it makes no difference to what you charge. It only makes a difference to the academics, right? So again, you see so if you choose to go the academic route and you do all of that, there aren't that many, and you can only supervise so many people, because now I'm in the field of education, but it works the same with my colleagues in psychology. I'm lecturing X number of modules, plus I'm doing my own research, plus I need to supervise you. I can only take 4 or 5 students to supervise, plus in psychology I have to look at your clinic hours. So there's only so many students I can do as one person, right? And so they can only employ so many lecturers, because that's how many modules you have, you see? And so that's where the complication comes in. And that is why it's almost a self-fulfilling thing, because there are so few students getting into the master's program and qualifying, because there are so few academics who are able to supervise you. And then the more we have burnout in academia, and people are saying, well, you know, my social justice has gone out the window because I'm actually struggling to get by and I'm exhausted and I'm burning out, so I'm going to go back into private practice. Then again, there's fewer supervisors to supervise the students, right? And it's that kind of thing, is that, you know, where do you even influence that system? Because if we could get more students into a master's program, we would have more psychologists in the field, but, you know, to get that is, and so that really is the complication. And all I can say to you is that looking at a master's or a PhD program, my biggest advice to you would be to connect with the academics already. Get to know people and form networks, because I promise you, I have worlds of time to have conversations with people that are interested and passionate about what we're doing, than to have to now pick a name out of a hat and supervise you for 2 years, right? And so if I know you from the honors program, or even from a different university, and you dropped an email, you made an appointment and you wanted to understand more, or you connected through these kind of networks or PsySSA conferences, right? You can put a face to a name, and then I would meet you and I say, hi, Dené. So that when Dené eventually drops in and I say, I'm ready to do my master's, my PhD, and this is where my interests are, and this is where I'm at, I promise you those panels, those review panels are very, very small in psychology. You're going to see the same faces sitting in your selections panel as you will reviewing your article, as you will in your conferences, you know. So network, and if that's not the number one priority inside, if anybody asks me what is psychology about, it's about relationships. It's really about relationships. And if you understand that, you will get yourself into a master's and a PhD program. Understand there's a human being like me on the other end that's working late and is tired, and these kind of things invigorate me. So of course I'm going to want to engage with a person that I've seen and I've known and I've developed a network with, rather than have strangers in front of me and now I've got to commit 2 or 3 years of my time to you. So really that is, if you're looking to get into those spaces, PhD is the same, you know, make those connections, meet people.
I think it's also important, if you are planning on getting into masters, is to get life experience, working with people. Because it's one thing to read things in a textbook, but it's a different story to experience them. And in my experience, most of the time, it was completely different from what I read in the books. And if you can bring in that experience, because they're not expecting you to be a trained person, they're just looking for certain qualities that they can harness and that they can train so that you can become the best you are. So live life, engage with life. That's also where the training occurs. It's not just in the academic training. But I'm also thinking that masters is not the ultimate route. There are other options that one can follow. And because it's so difficult to get into masters, familiarize yourself with other ways. Otherwise, you're just going to feel like you failed and there's no way out. Find ways. If there's no other way, create a way for yourself. And try to get into masters then while doing the other things also. I see there's a comment in terms of a lack of public posts. Yeah, that's probably a conversation also all on its own, is how mental health and mental illnesses are viewed within our society. Why is there not more posts within government? I used to work in government, and there's a few psychologists in government, and I needed assistance, but government was not creating the post. And it made me wonder, what is the importance of mental health, and where my responsibility lies in starting that conversation in the spaces where I work.
If I may jump in, Dr. Cherrington, Ms. Du Rand, we've just been discussing psychology and honours master's level. We're still in South Africa and Africa and in many countries dealing with the hegemony of Eurocentric Western psychology. I remember in my first year, there wasn't even a single supplementary to my very American textbook about African psychology. The most information that I've gained about African psychology, liberation psychology, etc., is through PsySSA. It's just not in our textbooks. And we hear about, or those of us who are involved with PsySSA or are already involved in community work have an exposure to African psychology, to decolonizing psychology, the practice and the curriculum of psychology. But for students, or for us students who are still studying, and there's no section in our textbook, not even a supplementary PDF to accompany it, about African psychology, the decolonization of psychology. What can students do to educate ourselves outside of our textbooks?
Okay, so you can't look within a colonial education to get something that is non-colonial, right? So that is your first thing. Understand that our education system has not transformed in decades. And so academia is still very much colonized as well. So for me to publish something, who's going to review it, read it, who's going to charge me the page fees to do it is very, very difficult, right? And I'm not going to get the Department of Higher Education subsidies unless I publish in certain journals who are owned by traditional white-owned academics, right? So what's the point, right? And so what you're looking for information in a very standardized way, that's not going to, it's going to give you very sanitized information. You need to look outside of that. You need to look at the key authors. There is so much knowledge, about indigenous knowledge system. African psychology is not new, it's been going, right? And there's this notion as well, you know, in terms of, there isn't the word psychology in the African community sense. Yes, but the role that the psychologist plays is very much in an African community sense. It always has been. Maybe that individual is not known as a psychologist, because a psychologist is very much a westernized Eurocentric concept, but the value of that person performs in a community is very much, and has been forever, in all communities around the world. Every community has a person who looks after the health and well-being of that community at multiple levels, and you can call him or her different things, right? So that's always existed. And it's that mind shift that we need to break away from, because unfortunately, while our institutions are still very rigid, the knowledge out there is not. And so you have to do this dual thing of, you have to conform your exams and your questions and, you know, the tick boxes that you have to do. And if you're very lucky, a lot of our universities have amazing scholars who are publishing outside of the formal academic circles, who do amazing group chats, who do support groups, who do online social media. The knowledge is there, you know, and it's one of those things that you have to kind of be open to it and start listening to which of your academics are talking about these things. Look outside of the formalized books and publishing, and you will start to read more things, and you will find more things that are interesting, and you'll find a wealth of knowledge and networks out there. But unfortunately, we're still sitting with the same faces in the same institutions, you know, and I think that can be quite daunting.
If I can use a bit of my experience also, I teach African epistemologies in the Masters in Clinical Psychology program at UNISA. And the reason why we are doing that is to sensitize our students to the different cultures that you get in South Africa, and also to teach them to not pathologize if something is a bit different from the Western way of doing things. But the other side of the coin is also, we're not saying the Western way of doing things is incorrect. That you learn how to sit with these differences. And how I got involved in these things, or started thinking more critically about these things, is, I think you talked about it, Genevieve. In my undergrad, there was a little chapter at the back of my textbook that I saw, oh, this is something I can relate to, or that explains a bit more of the problems that I am seeing. And then obviously looking at who writes about it and going and reading up on it, that's on the one hand. But on the other hand, also engaging with people who are like-minded and who think like this, because in engaging with them, my worldview broadened. And I think there's something beautiful to these experiences, is the more you engage with these like-minded people, the more they come into your life. You don't know how it happens, it just happens. And you have these experiences, and it might not be an academic person. It could just be someone in the community that teaches you about being real with someone else, or being genuine with someone else, or just being and existing with someone else, even if you are different. And I think those experiences were probably my biggest lessons, because when I engaged with people, I would always be curious and open and ask, but why do you do 1, 2, and 3? Even if I didn't do 1, 2, and 3. And in doing things in that way, I'm hoping, I can't say I'm there yet, then I'm decolonizing my mind as well. So it starts with you, and then you can go to the outside.
Thank you very much for your responses. Definitely a lot of students that we speak to at the Student Division, and that I just have conversations with fellow students, when they get to honours or master's level, and you know, African psychology is introduced for the very first time, it's a shock to the system, because it's contrary to what we study. Not contrary, but it's not delved into in what we study in our undergrad degrees. So but as you said, Dr. Cherrington and Ms. Du Rand, is that it's not about one replacing the other. It's about two different, very, very different sides coming together, because we are a multicultural society in South Africa, and that's one of the most profound beauties about South Africa is our multiculturalism. But at the same time, because of our multiculturalism, we should have multiple dynamic approaches. So I think a lot of people also become a little bit threatened or nervous when they think that it's about one replacing the other or taking over from the other. It really isn't. But it's very, very interesting to study it, and certainly to attend presentations and conferences, and to really realize the necessity for these conversations, and for one to find information on these topics. It's very important. So thank you very, very, very much. We have a question higher up in the chat from Patrick, who says, "Good day, thoroughly enjoying the webinar." Thank you, Patrick. "Please speak to the assessment and evaluation of community projects. How does one go about it in the most efficient and effective way?"
I suppose I would ask, well, it depends, efficient and effective to who, before I evaluate and assess, because, you know, you mean for the people, the funders and the organizers who are coming in and have agendas and tick boxes and need to, you know, do an audit report and they define what is effective and efficient? Or do you mean to the people who are actually engaging and supposedly this is for and with them? Because I think the problem I've personally experienced with a lot of development and intervention programs is it's more about the conflict of agendas and interests than it ever is about the issue. You know, money never comes for free. There's always you sell your soul to the devil, so to speak. And so it's about understanding what the funders are wanting, while still being ethically responsible to the self-determination rights of the people who they are supposedly helping, right? Because, you know, it's never really about helping anybody. It's just about, you know, where the money goes and so forth. So, you know, so I can't really tell you in terms of like assessment evaluation. I think the idea there is in terms of, like I say, you know, assessing, evaluating for what and for whom. And knowing that as a psychologist and a community psychologist, you kind of standing with, you know, one foot in each ground, and you have a fund, you need that money. You cannot produce or get involved or do the services that you need to do without the money. But at the same token, the needs are very, very different. And you owe it to the community that you're with to also protect them in some ways, right? And so I don't know if that's answered your question, but it's difficult to kind of say that. And I think, again, it comes down to relationships, because if you, too many times people rush into community development because it's a need and it's a crisis and we must help, without actually tying things up, without building rapport, without understanding people and the different expectations. And ultimately, when it comes to the monitoring and evaluation, which should actually be happening throughout, suddenly it becomes an issue because we don't know what we're assessing, we don't know what we're evaluating, because we never took the time, we just rushed in to the you know. And so for me, that's where the issue comes. I would spend weeks and months before any services are done, because I often find that it's more about the listening and the building relationships. And if I get those wheels going, oftentimes the people involved just figure things out and initiate things out way before I could ever come and do anything, you know. So I would say that would be my most important thing, is relationships and understanding who wants what and why. What do they need to get at the end of the day, and finding a middle ground.
I think if it is in a context of having intervened and you want to assess that project, then obviously before doing the intervention, you do a needs analysis, and this is done in collaboration with the community. So it's not that you're defining something as a problem, but did the community also agree it is a problem? And utilizing the resources within the community is now one aspect of designing an intervention, but then the community will be the people that needs to give feedback. Did this intervention work or did it not work? That's maybe one other aspect of evaluation, but I agree, you need to know for who and why are you doing the evaluation.
Keep forgetting to unmute myself. Sorry, it's late on Friday afternoon. That is my excuse. We've come to the end of our hour. Thank you so much, Dr. Cherrington and Ms. Du Rand, for being here today and for taking the time to address our questions and to discuss community psychology. And based on the comments that we've received, this has been a very helpful conversation. Thank you so much for that. And we do have some participants who are still sending questions. I'll make a note of these questions. I'll take them down and I'll compile a document, Dr. Cherrington and Ms. Du Rand, if that's okay, to forward to you for the remaining questions. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Leanne says, have a wonderful Women's Day. Thank you to everyone for being here. We appreciate it. What I'm going to do now is I'm also, again, going to post the website link to CaSP's page on PsySSA's website and CaSP's social media. There is an option for students. There's a student registration category for CaSP. So you'll find that information on CaSP's page on the website. Please have a look at it and join CaSP. Very active division. At the student division, we really do love CaSP. So we encourage you to follow CaSP and to join CaSP and to, as Dr. Cherrington and Ms. Du Rand said, networking is very important. Meeting people, so that when one receives an email or a phone call, say, I know this person, I'm familiar with this person, and just really also exposing yourself more to community psychology. So please have a look at CaSP.
And Genevieve, if I may quickly just pipe in here also just to shamelessly promote our division. We have an annual seed grant project, and I don't know if any of the members know about it. We're really proud of it. We basically, as a division, all our membership money plus donations goes into capacity building of community projects. And so we have a competition where we ask, you have to be a member of CaSP, but for students, it's like a 20 Rand annual fee. You can sign up to be a CaSP member and then join the competition. It's really, I think this year we're giving away 3,000 Rand towards a community-based project. There's a form you fill in and you motivate your project, and it's really, you get a chance to sit with myself and our vice chair, who's Santosh Pillay, and we do a mentorship and we help you write projects or an article, and we do some, capacity building workshops, and plus of course you get the money for your project. So please have a look at our social media and our web. We've had so much interest in it that we're going to actually extend. It was supposed to be due this week, and we thought, well, you know what, we're chatting to all of you guys, so we're going to extend it for another week, till next Friday. So please have a look. It's a wonderful opportunity, and Khomotso, who won our prize last year, is a member of our executive now this year, and she's also written a lot about her own project and how it's helped. So if you are interested in that, if you've got small projects going and would like to be more involved, then please go have a look at our seed grant project.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Cherrington and Ms. Du Rand. Thank you again for joining us. Okay, there we go. Oh, I see Khomotso has posted the link to the seed grant competition.
Thanks, Khomotso.
Thank you, everyone. Please take care. Have a lovely weekend. Have a lovely Women's Day. And please keep an eye on the Student Division social media and CaSP social media for the webinar link. And we'll see you at the next Ask Us Anything. And as I said, I have noted all of the questions that were posed once we ran out of time, so we will address those as well. Have a lovely weekend. Have a lovely day. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.